Okay, so we left off here talking about impact dynamics of these different resources, in particular water, last Wednesday. So let's get back into that. We talked about the resource now. We've gone through a case study with Carlsbad. Gone through a case study involving Carlsbad Caverns. And we are going through what are the characteristic ways in which, specifically as a function of recreation, how do we damage our water resources, both flowing, so liquid, and frozen. That's not all parts of the water cycle, but those are the most direct and recognizable forms of forest recreation resource water impacts as a clear function of recreation. So we also want to talk about some of the biological impacts, and that's what Pikachu is going to help us explore. So by biological impacts, we have essentially bacteria, viruses, prions. So chronic wasting disease, for example, can spread through water contamination from deer to deer, and very occasionally, it seems very occasionally, from deer to human in specific cases. But we also have higher order life forms beyond. So a prion is just a very specific kind of protein. It's not a living thing. It doesn't respond to the environment. All it does is, by virtue of being close enough to a biological molecule, it tricks bodies into reproducing them. So this is how things like encephalopathy happen. So mad cow disease, that it's away at brain tissue, right? It's not a bacteria reproducing out of control. It is your body manufacturing this prion over and over and over, and that essentially exploding the cells as it goes. So that is not even a life form. And then viruses are sort of life adjacent. Bacteria are about as simple a life form as we can have these days. And for the purposes of this class, this is not taxonomically correct. It's not even close. But I'm going to use bacteria to shorthand other kinds of very simple unicellular or polycellular organisms like yeasts and Archaeobacter, etc. Then we do have more higher order organisms like protozoans, which from the name, right, proto or prototypes or early or example sort of precursor form of zoan, which is long Greek for animal, right? So viruses get killed by everything from sunlight to pure oxygen to temperature variation and so forth. Bacteria can be killed by almost as much. Throw fungi in there as well. Protozoans, bacteria are killed by soap, right? So saponification reaction pulls the cell membrane of a bacterium apart, and the cell literally disintegrates. Protozoans can be, by virtue of much more, comparative to bacteria, these much more advanced genetic capability to adapt to their environment. Protozoans can do things like encyst, meaning wrap themselves in a protein coat if the environment gets too dry, for example. So if they're in the water column and the water gets splashed up onto the shore and the water infiltrates through the soil or runs over land back down into that water body, and the protozoan is left behind, it can wrap itself in a thin candy shell like an M&M and just kind of go dormant for a while. Up to 10 years in some cases, like with the protozoan Giardia lamblia, which causes giardiasis. And we're going to call these biological impacts essentially pathogens, so living things that are pathological or injurious to humans, We're going to call these our biological impacts to humans and to wildlife. Okay. So, Giardia is native in a lot of places, native to the environment. Another bacteriological, so Giardia again a protozoan, but another bacteriological pathogen that is native even in our guts is going to be something like Escherichia coli, E. coli, right? And there are thousands of different strains or subtypes of E. coli, some of which we actually need to survive. They help us in the digestive and metabolic processes that keep us alive. They're part of our gut bacterium, our gut flora. However, there are a whole lot of E. coli bacterial strains that produce their own metabolic toxins, their equivalent, their cellular level equivalent of feces or poop, that is highly irritating to us or even genuinely toxic or poisonous. So, in this way, when if I brought my dogs to Campus Lake, a little beach over there, and one of my dogs pooped on the beach, and I didn't notice it or didn't pick it up because I am a human pile of shit for deciding not to do that, that is chock full of E. coli. Our feces is typically chock full of E. coli. And the strains that dogs can harbor in their bodies are not necessarily the same sets of strains that we can harbor in ours. So, rainwater arrives, washes those E. coli into Campus Lake, and then the next person, up to a couple of years later, who goes swimming at Campus Lake and gets a little bit of lake water in the mucous membranes of their eyes, or a little bit up into their sinuses, or maybe, God forbid, swallows any lake water out of Campus Lake, and so forth, right? It can make that person very sick. Now, it's not necessarily a life-threatening infection because we have things like modern antibiotics, right? The premise of us interacting with our environment is completely different with the advent of modern antibiotics all the way back to penicillin, right? We get the germ theory of illness in the late and early 1900s. We have guys like Joseph Lister inventing stuff or having things like Listerine named after him to kill off harmful bacteria, in that case in our mouths. And all of a sudden, the wide world of everywhere that looks interesting to hike to, or to skydive down to, or to swim in and all that, it's a lot more accessible, for the most part. But in some cases, where we have things like amoeba, single-cell organisms that, the amoeba, let's see, is it Naegleria fowleri or Fowleri naegleria, the brain-eating amoeba that is present in warm waters in, for example, the southeastern United States. If you go swimming in a pond in Florida or southern coastal Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, there is a reasonable chance that you can wash that up into your sinuses and it'll go transdermally through your sinus passages into your brain cavity and sort of eat its way through. And the brain-blood barrier is a privileged, or provides a privileged blood supply to the brain immunologically. So if you take a bunch of antibiotics, those antibiotics don't necessarily get into your brain or your spinal cord, which is segregated from the entire rest of your body in terms of nutrient supply, blood supply, and immunological defenses. So, all this to say, when wildlife is doing as wildlife does, it is contributing to a vibrant and healthy and diverse ecosystem. The problem is, as we get more and more separated from our natural environment, yet we grow our capacity to go deeper into that environment with our modern technologies. We don't have constant exposure to a lot of this stuff. We don't have resistance to a lot of this stuff. And so somebody can get really, really sick or even die from something like a brain-eating amoeba or a brain-eating prion, etc., on down the list, or just die of an absolutely curable protozoan like Giardia, for example. The way that Giardia kills people in the developed world is when somebody is way off in the backcountry backpacking, they get Giardia, and Giardia causes extreme GI upset and things like vomiting, uncontrollable explosive diarrhea, and so forth. So gross, scatological jokes, all that. But it's severely dehydrating. So within 48 hours, you can be unable to walk and unable to give your body the nutrients you need to hike back out and go to a hospital and just get the crazy intense antibiotics that wipe Giardia lamblia and everything else growing, even all the healthy bacteria, out of your system, and you're completely reset bacteriologically. Stuff like Cipro or ciprofloxacin is very common as a sort of off-label, even prophylactic use among backpackers. When I graduated college and hiked the Appalachian Trail in 2004, 20 years ago, because I'm old now, it was a not at all unheard of practice for backpackers to take a little trip down to Mexico and cross the border at a town like Nogales, for example, and like 100 yards on the other side of the international border, back then at least, I don't know if it's like this now, there were rows and rows, like 3 or 4 or 5 in a row on the same street, for example, all these farmacias where you could go and get expensive in the United States or illegal to access in the United States without a prescription, things like heavy-duty antibiotics. Ciprofloxacin is what the United States will use if we ever have a widespread terror attack, for example, and somebody cultures up a whole bunch of anthrax, right, to be a biological weapon as a terrorist. So every once in a while somebody will get mailed a package of white powder and they have to shut down the post office and shut down that person's house and fumigate everything and test it and make sure it's not anthrax so that the person opens the letter and doesn't get a puff of dust and die. Ciprofloxacin works against things like anthrax. So it's a pretty serious thing, and in the United States at least you need a prescription to have it. And so backpackers, hikers, thinking, well, if I'm hiking for 6 months straight, I'm probably going to forget to wash my hands like at least once in that time and do fecal oral contamination, get myself real sick, and potentially end my hike for a reason that I can prevent if I cross the border to buy these medications illegally and cross back over the border and just forget to mention them to customs and so forth. Not that I did that. I'm just saying that people around the time that I was hiking the AT would do that, hypothetically. And there was enough demand for that you could have 5 Walgreens and CVS's in a row, and all of those be supported by that kind of sort of low-key or gray market demand. So we have to consider people who are bringing their dogs to your national park by the thousands every day in peak season, right? Those feces go somewhere. Now, we'll talk about the impacts of dogs separately in our wildlife section, but biological as a contamination, as a problem, as a safety risk for your visitors, this is half the reason why we have so many strict leash laws and policies and angry-looking signs at trailheads saying your dog must be on a leash or no pets allowed on this trail. We can't keep water sources safe when visitors do stuff like this because it only takes one visitor every 10 years per water source to contaminate that water source for literally everybody else for the next decade. Right? So some of these things, like Giardia, for example, encysting protozoans. This is encysting, not insisting. So N into a cyst, or a little bacteriological scale potato with with a protective shell around it. Right? So we don't have any margin for error on this. And obviously, right, we can post signs at each of these spring water sources or stream crossings saying, hey, you have to treat this water. You need to, at the elevation here, you need to boil it for at least 2 minutes. Or at higher elevations, at least 10 minutes. Or above, 8,000 feet, you can't boil water long enough to heat it up above about 140 degrees Fahrenheit, because at higher elevations you have lower water vapor pressure, and so it boils at closer and closer to room temperature. Now to the point of if we were in outer space or in a really high and possibly high mountain, right? Uncapped, pressurized water would just boil at room temperature, and that's not killing anything in it. So, all this dog, no pun intended, and pony show to say, yeah, we got to pay attention to people needing to walk their dogs and the legitimate desire and motivation to bring the family pets along as, functionally speaking, family members when they visit your national park, right? If you haven't seen a video like this on TikTok, Instagram, right, where somebody is anthropomorphizing or buying even dog-specific outdoor gear, right, you haven't been online. And I think we've all been online at least for a few minutes in the past decade or so. So none of this is going to be a surprise for any of us, right? Ultimate anime betrayal. We have no control over who or what is urinating, defecating, or dead and decomposing upstream, or even not anywhere physically close to the water body. Studies have shown that in particular alpine environments and subalpine environments, pathogens from shallowly or not at all buried feces can be transmitted by overland flow down a steep slope for over a mile, right? So if I've got somebody taking a dump way up here on the slope, and I have people down here camping by a beautiful creek that is itself very clean, if anybody's pooped up slope within a mile of that space, which is a pretty long way, the bacteria, the viruses, etc., they can get down there. Now, a mile is a pretty long distance relative to the size of a bacterium. So it's not going to be this off the top of the charts intense concentration of fecal coliform or Giardia or whatever from a single fecal source a mile upslope. But it works. And for a lot of these, you don't need a huge loading dose in order to get sick. Right? So for every pathogen you need to ingest, or they need to cross the dermal barrier or what have you, in some number before you actually get sick, right? Because some of them are going to get intercepted, some of them are going to die along the way, etc. So it's not necessarily that, oh my gosh, I breathed in one bacterium one time and it's now taken over my whole body, right? We might need 10,000. For things like COVID, we need maybe tens of thousands to millions to hundreds of millions of bacterial particles in order for enough of those to actually get through and start propagating and that whole deal, okay? Wow, we've been cycling on this slide for an uncomfortably long time. Ultimate anime betrayal. This is a video that I took at Great Smoky Mountains National Park. You'll note the artistic use of slow motion to underscore the severity and awfulness of the human condition. We are wretched in how we treat each other. And in fact, now that I mention it, segueing into work today, I passed a loaded diaper that somebody had rolled down the window on their vehicle, thrown out, and it had come to a stop in kind of the rain gutter on Chautauqua, like a high-speed road. Like some waste of human life made a decision to dispose of their baby's dirty diaper on the side of the road so that all of the rest of us could deal with that, right? Like there's just some percentage of the population that's okay with that. My wife and I were at a McDonald's one time where we were just traveling cross country to go visit family, and we watched another vehicle pull up, open the door,
dump a bunch of trash, including loaded diapers, plural, close the door, and drive off again. And on the other side of the vehicle was a trash can, right? There is some part of the population that just wants to watch the world burn, that doesn't care what their effects on other people might include, including negative effects. So, as a park ranger, as a forester more broadly, as a conservation police officer, or CO or CPO, a law enforcement ranger, right? We are dealing with folks like this. And so there are some aspects of national park or park design and management that we can do to help with certain things, but there is always going to be this irreducible, this fundamental, this inescapable characteristic of just some small, thankfully, percentage of the population that is just going to do stuff like this in a national park, right? This is a beautiful place with as close as we can possibly have to pristine east of the Mississippi riverine and stream freshwater ecosystems for things like world-class salamander, hellbender, mud puppy, small lizard habitat, right? Great Smoky Mountains National Park is an international biosphere reserve for specifically reason of its clean water. We have people like this throwing stuff like this into that water, right? And we should expect this every day. If 1% of our visitors are doing this, and we have 10,000 visitors on site that day, if 1% of 10,000 visitors are doing this, how many people is that? 10,000 is not a hard number to reach for a lot of our national parks this semester. So how many new loaded diapers should I be expecting as superintendent of Saluki National Park if I have a 1% problem rate among 10,000 visitors per day? 100, yeah. So 1% is 1/100th, and 1/100th times 10,000 is 100. So that when the sun goes up every day, I know that I know that I know that I have something higher or slightly lower than 100 new diapers to find every single day. When the sun comes up, you better be running. Okay. This is sort of an unfortunate consequence of human nature. Here is human feces at Treasure Falls. This is another video that I took on summer camp several years ago. And it smelled like hot dogs, guys. Right? So the problem with dog feces is that dogs can be a host to some strains of E. coli and things like Giardia without getting sick from them. And then a human coming in contact with those feces in any way, petting your dog near its hindquarters, and then not washing your hands and picking your nose later, right? Or inoculating yourself with everything that's come out of those hindquarters, potentially. The problem with human feces, and another sort of 1%er kind of problem, 1% of visitors think it's really funny or a great idea to leave a Cleveland steamer right next to the trail, right in front of a beautiful, like 50, 60 foot high waterfall. The problem is that it's not a few species of pathogens that human can be host to and therefore transmit to another human. Everything that human is carrying can be transmitted to another human because it's just another human. There's no species shift or jump or different conditions for all of those pathogens to make. It's just a one-to-one transfer, right? So this is the issue. Has anybody ever traveled internationally to South Asia or maybe to Central America, like Mexico, for example? Or have you heard of something like Montezuma's Revenge, right? Where the drinking water in a lot of other countries is safe to drink for the people who are adapted to that microbiological compendium of interesting creepy crawlies, right? but our biological systems as Americans are not tuned to those other countries' things. So even if it's not like eating feces, just that difference in what survives in their water versus what survives in our tap water. And our tap water is not sterile. It's treated for a lot of the most nasty stuff, but it's not 100% coverage, right? We don't add things like chloramine in high enough concentration to totally like pool shock it to death. Right, so anyway, all this to say, lots of ways in which we can have people and adjacent creatures contaminating our water supply in a recreational context. Right, if you've ever peed or blown bubbles, but not from your mouth, in a pool or a swimming hole or a hot spring or anything like that, right? You can see how we do this stuff without even meaning to, right? So you dive into a pond or a swimming hole, and all of the fecal coliform bacteria that might just be on you from the last time when you wiped as clearly and cleanly as you could, or maybe you used a bidet, if you're super fancy, but the bidet wasn't doing like sterilization type operations, it was just sort of rinsing you mostly clean, right? A lot of that stuff sheds off of your body as you dive into that water in kind of a plume. And it's an invisible plume, but a plume nonetheless. Okay? So, without even really trying to, we can be our own worst enemy. So, hot springs are another piece of that. Now, I should note that hot springs tend to be much more highly mineralized and tend to be at a much higher temperature, which severely limits the kinds of pathogens that can arrive in that water off of a plume from us, or have dog poop washed into them from rain, overland flow. This can be cleaner, but that's no kind of guarantee, right? If it's only 30% deadly instead of 75% deadly, like, it's still pretty gross. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So, how does this look? And what are the ways in which this particular impact, what are its dynamics? If you have ever seen a toilet paper flower, which is crumpled up used toilet paper on the side of a trail, this is at a trailhead that we're standing in a parking lot, right? This is another video from summer camp out east at White Mountains National Forest. This is how this stuff happens, right? So where you have people leaving toilet paper flowers in your parking lots, in front of your visitor centers, in front of your trails, that's a pretty clear signal that people are saying, we have no idea what we're doing. We arrived at this place unprepared. Or maybe we're even experienced hikers. We just had really bad indigestion last night from a local eatery, and we're not feeling so great today, and this is an unavoidable impact. So where you have a lot of visitors, this is going to happen much more commonly, and so you bite the bullet and you install toilets. So at Bear Lake Trailhead in Rocky Mountain National Park, only one of that park's major trail system sort of heads with big parking lot and stuff like that. Over the past, 20 years now, they've installed something like 12.5 toilets all in a row, and people just sort of line up in front of them and go to them all day long, right? Because a bunch of toilet paper flowers older than 20 years ago were piling up at that trailhead, right? Thousands of people a day use the Bear Lake Road trailhead. It's a beautiful, beautiful hiking corridor. And I'll skip that example. This is an issue, right? So at Haleakala, on that previous slide, even in remote wilderness, at the top of a volcano, days of hiking away from a trailhead, there are no potty facilities inside the wilderness there. And if even 1 out of a million visitors over 50 years of hiking there or backpacking there don't know how to dig a cat hole, don't know to, or get grossed out by the idea of packing out their own feces, well then you're gonna have toilet paper flowers. And in that environment, those toilet paper flowers could be around 30, 40, 50 years, right? That's an environment where you're not getting rain. You're not getting any soil biological activity that breaks apart things like toilet paper, breaks down and competes with and even kills soil bacteria or soiled tissue bacteria, okay? We also have to understand the difference in perception between the biological reality of everybody poops and what everybody thinks about everybody and everything pooping, right? So, anybody ever been on a trail system that horses also use? Right? Horses just poop right in the middle of the trail, right? They're not going to stop. It is very, very unusual to have horses wear sort of undercarriage diapers, which is a thing, and it works fine for horse-drawn carriages in St. Louis, New York City, and stuff like that. They're just sort of wearing a loose bag underneath their hindquarters, and it just catches piles, and they emptied it out at the end of the shift. But for trail riders, oh no, that is way too dorky to enjoy our trail rides, so we're just going to poop in the middle of the trail and go with it, okay? So, collectively, all these are biological impacts. I think we made the point pretty well here. Let's go through a couple of key biological contaminants or pathogens. So these are things that make humans sick and what those look like. Salmonella, you may have heard of, from potentially handling certain wildlife species or coming into contact with contaminated water or bringing contaminated food in. You can get salmonella from a couple of different kinds of very normal human foods. Okay? Salmonella is awful. I got a salmonella infection one time, and I don't ever want to do that again. It is awful. It's absolutely curable, treatable if you catch it in time, but again, right, 12 to 72 hours, you could be pretty far from a trailhead and get into some nasty trouble and lose your capacity over that 12 to 72 hours, that first 3 days of onset of symptoms. And if you could hike 2 miles an hour at the beginning of that, you can't hike 0.2 miles an hour because you can't even crawl as the stuff gets worse and worse. So, Salmonella, Shigella. This one's a little bit less common, and you'll notice there's a lot of overlap between the presenting symptoms, right? So the symptomology is going to be pretty indeterminate for these. So the lesson here for us as park rangers isn't that we all need to become wilderness EMTs and learn how to diagnose which specific pathogen is an issue. It is, if anybody gets back to a trailhead vomiting, presenting with diarrhea and a fever, we have to assume it's any, maybe even multiple of these, because if they got contaminated with one, it's not like they can't be sick with another one on top of that, right? So we work very closely with local definitive medical care, as it's called. So that would be like an emergency room, a 24-hour doc in the box on urgent care, depending on the severity of it. If they just need to prescribe you a Z-Pak or something like that, so zithromycin, and you take that for 10 to 14 days, and you're just outpatient, you're out in 10 minutes to get the script filled. Or if you need something like Cipro, right, we get folks to the medical professionals immediately, and we have to work proactively with those ambulance companies to connect up the recreation source of the rescue or medical exfiltration and make sure there is a navigable and safe for the EMTs way to get them from point A to point B. So this is particularly an issue at places like Jackson Falls Natural Area on the Shawnee National Forest. Again, not a national park, but the health concern issues are exactly relevant, pressing, the same. Right? People get sick. There's a bunch of horseback riding in Jackson Falls Basin. There's a bunch of surface water flowing through Jackson Falls Basin. It's really beautiful waterfalls and stuff like that when the waterfalls and the streams are flowing. And if you're arriving early in the spring season, for example, right, last year's horse poop has been washed into those streams, and you're not necessarily seeing that or thinking about it. You know, dipping your hands in after you climb your crash pad or climbing gear down into Jackson Falls, you're hot and sweaty, stuff like that, and splashing stream water up on your face, and maybe a little bit gets into your mouth, the corner of your mouth, and you're getting sick from last year's horse feces in that water. It happens. Next, Campylobacter. All right. We have GI symptoms, so vomiting, diarrhea, stomach upset, but this one also tends to have blood in the stool as well. And Campylobacter has a lot of vectors, right? So mammals, basically, mammals and birds. Anytime any of these can be transmitted by a bird, you have to assume that it is everywhere, because a lot of birds don't have anal sphincter control in the way that we expect mammals do. So when they poop, they poop. It just kind of happens, right? Yeah, you didn't think any of your forestry classes were going to mention the phrase anal sphincter control. You're welcome. All right, E. coli, right? Again, we all have lots of E. coli. And this is not particularly dangerous in terms of pathology, right? You just feel gross when you have an E. coli infection. But if you are immune compromised and hiking, for example, that can move you into that 60 deaths per year statistic pretty quickly. Usually this is more from 10,000 people buy the same spinach or arugula or something at the grocery store from the same farm facility where they've been spraying down those fields with manure too late in the season, and the E. coli in that cow and horse feces water chemical slurry lives on those spinach leaves and makes it all the way through a couple of stages of washing to the grocery store, or to E. coli contamination happens in places like Chipotle, for example. It seems like every year Chipotle has to have a press conference like, yeah, we killed 6 people this year. We're down by 20%, so that's good, E. coli it's all over the place. It is nasty. If you've ever had a 24-hour flu bug, there's a reasonable chance it was actually E. coli. It has nothing to do with influenza whatsoever, and so forth. So this is ubiquitous, a little bit less serious, but because it is absolutely fucking everywhere, we deal with it. All right. So this is how you look when you have an E. coli infection. All right. Here's a quick rundown from a research study on how much E. coli we all produce. So 1.9 times 10 to the 9th. That's 9 zeros after the decimal. That's up in the billions per day, per organism, right? Now a lot of those are going to die right away from UVA, UVB, UVC, sunlight, so non-ionizing radiation that is enough to photolize or snap apart bacterial DNA from high-frequency, near-visible light energy. But for anything that makes it down into the soil, down into the water column, if that water's at all turbid, right, cloudy, we don't get that UV sterilizing radiation onto it. So back in the 70s and 80s, when we're in that phase of recreation visitation doubling every decade from 20 million to 40 million, 40 million to 80 million, 80 million to 160 million, 160 million up to 320 million visits a year, right? Doubling every decade. One of the solutions for dealing with this in places where toilet paper is an alpine environment, a cryo environment, a desert environment, a low rainfall environment, whether or not it's desert, any of these environments where toilet paper is just not going to decompose and it's just going to pile up. The solution for some of these places was to take the feces in the hand, or in potentially gloved hand if you're real fancy, and smear it very thinly on a rock surface that is in the northern hemisphere here, the southern aspect or exposure, and the sun bakes those feces into biologically dead, biologically inert, sterilized soil precursor, right? And then it dries up, cracks off of that rock face, and gets incorporated into that otherwise nutrient-poor soil, right? And that was great. And as awful as that is, that was a better solution. That was the plan B. That was the improvement on the previous feces and toilet paper disposal method from the 50s and 60s of punt your crunk, lay your pipe, what have you, wipe your butt, take that ball of toilet paper with feces on it, light it on fire, and then drop it before your fingers burn. And let fire sterilize and consume and volatilize, basically turn into carbon dioxide, both the biomass of that fecal residuum and the toilet paper carbon content itself. Just vaporize it all off into the atmosphere and we don't have to worry about it. Smearing feces on rocks was considered an improvement on that because in places where you had to light toilet paper on fire to dispose of it because of poor soil decomposition action, poor soil microbial decomposition, whatever, it's also likely to be very windy. Right? So an alpine environment, very high elevation, there are no trees. There's no biologically active soil, very thin, very slow biologically active soils in those areas. And so people were lighting toilet paper and dropping it, and then a wind gust would take the burning toilet paper flour wherever the wind was blowing. And so people were actually, there are a few recorded cases of people further on the trail or down the slope and unaffiliated with the pooping party, receiving, unexpectedly, burning, fecally smeared toilet paper unto themselves, right? What could possibly go wrong? You know how combustible hair is, guys, right? Imagine coming off a mountain with a patch of hair gone, little speckles of like fricasseed or lightly grilled feces like splattered onto your face. Like, this was happening. Not often, but it was happening. And the fact that it was happening at all, already unacceptable, right? So there's been an evolution. Like, this is the time before we had wag bags. So feces, collection bags made of mylar, which is oxygen impermeable, stink impermeable, waterproof. There'd be a mylar bag filled with a little bit of quicklime to cut the stink in the moment. And you could have poop and or pee in that bag, seal the inner bag, seal the outer bag, put a mesh bag around that, strap it to the outside of your pack in case you forget and puncture it somehow, right? We hadn't invented mylar yet. That's a NASA technology, and the space race started only in the 1960s. So, Forest and Outdoor Recreation Management has had to cope with E. coli contamination, and that was the solution for a while back in the bad old days. All right, next up, cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are not regular bacteria. They're halfway between like plant simple organisms and animal simple organisms. Cyanobacteria are particularly of concern in water bodies, which is why we're talking about them here, and specifically some of their metabolic byproducts called cyanotoxins are neurotoxic to humans. So anybody ever been to Florida for spring break or like a summer family vacation out to the beach? Okay. Has anybody ever seen or experienced or even heard of a red tide? All right. So a red tide is a harmful algal bloom, an HAB. And harmful algal blooms are typically actually cyanobacterial blooms. So 10 years ago, Campus Lake had a cyanobacteria and therefore a neurotoxin problem here on campus. And so people's dogs were chasing frisbees out into the water in the middle of the summer here on Campus Lake. and then within a matter of hours starting to present neurological symptoms. So vestibular, they couldn't like turn left, they could only turn right. So they end up like face stuck in a corner in a room, or laterally recumbent, so not able to stand, so lying on one side, sort of struggling to get up, looking real dizzy or disoriented, and even straight up killing them. So mostly municipalities, in terms of managing outdoor recreation at beaches and stuff like that, they have an ongoing sort of periodic, regularly set up, almost automated cyanobacteria, cyanotoxin monitoring program. Whenever there's a big bloom, typically late spring, early summer, because these are heavily dependent on things like fertilizer over application, and that fertilizer excess gets washed into a water body like Campus Lake, causes the bloom. Cyanotoxin concentration spikes in the water, and then pets and children start getting sick or dying. And cyanotoxins they're nasty. I mean, they can straight up kill smaller organisms if you're not aware of it. And because they are neurotoxic, neurotoxins tend to act fairly quickly, and it can be difficult to treat those. Once they're in your system, right, they are going everywhere and disrupting everything in a basic nerve signal transmission level. And we need those to have our heartbeat and breathe, much less do things like run around and jump and play in the water. All right, Giardia is, again, a slightly higher order organism, and so it's not just a single cell, very simple thing that can get destroyed by the application of soap and water. They can protect themselves from stuff like that. So, one of the thru hikers I was hiking with in 2004 on the Appalachian Trail got a Giardia infection from one of the water sources in it was probably I want to say Pennsylvania, New Jersey, or New York, so north of the halfway mark, but hundreds of miles shy of the finish line. And she lost 30 pounds in a week and had to go to the hospital. A couple other hikers and I walked with her to make sure that she didn't just collapse 40 miles from the road crossing to get to the emergency room. So that was pretty uncomfortable for her. And when I say sudden onset violent diarrhea, what I'm talking about is in walking together on the trail from this side of the room, for example, to the other 20, 25 feet. It can be, I'm feeling fine at foot number 0, and at foot number 20, I get the signal from my brain-gut axis that, oh no, something is wrong, I'm about to poop right now, and by step 25, I'm pooping, right? It's that bad. So, I appreciate your maturity and taking this seriously. This doesn't kill a lot of people because, again, we just load people up with a horse dose of antibiotics, and it kills things off. But unfortunately, it's as hard for us to get in there as park rangers and clean up or put a warning sign on that water source, because it takes Giardia 1 to 2 weeks to incubate, to reproduce enough to the point that it's causing severe systemic disruptions. If somebody's hiking, a thru hiker in that area is hiking 20 to 30 miles per day, times 7 to 14 days, right? That could be any of maybe up to a couple of thousand water sources. So you just don't know as the ranger, right? And left by itself, it may not kill you, but without intensive antibiotics, which do clear it up right away, you're looking at 2 to 6 weeks of that violent, uncontrollable gas, diarrhea, vomiting. It's pretty bad. So, to underscore the severity of what these can do to your visitors and why we want to protect people, we have a couple of examples. So that's Giardia. This one is even more on the nose. I think we all know where this is going. So it can get to the point of when you are trying to eat, for example, you take your first spoonful of oatmeal that you've had all day, you swallow it, and immediately you're vomiting, or immediately that triggers voiding your bowels. You know, before, like, you're not digesting anything in a matter of seconds, right? It's, 24 to 72 hours to get all the way from one end to the other, typically. Like, you are starving your body and you're dehydrating your body aggressively and uncontrollably with this stuff. All right, next one. Cryptosporidium. Cryptosporidium is, this is an urban water supply problem. So water parks, for example, the Splash Park here in Carbondale has to worry about cryptosporidium contamination. Where you have a lot of children playing in water together, that fecal-oral contamination is very easy. And crypto is one of the organisms that's relatively well adapted to advance in by that particular thing. So this is super widespread, and this is one of the things that'll close down your neighborhood pool for a couple of days. When a child gets sick, they gotta close down the pool, typically by health regulations, shock the pool with a bunch of chlorine, so kill everything in that water, and then get the pH stabilized and the chlorine level stabilized, and then you can reopen the pool. So when a child, takes a dump in the pool and somebody sees like the log floating there, then this is one of the reasons that we are closing down that pool. So same thing for ponds and lakes in your national park, but we're not gonna like close down and pool shock the pond or lake in your park. We're just gonna advise people, hey, like, you need to shower off after getting in this water because of things like cryptosporidium. Hep A is a virus, not a bacterium, so antibiotics are not going to work on it. Now, we do have antiviral drugs, but we don't typically have good public health awareness of the differences between viruses and bacteria, or between viruses and protozoans, like Giardia. And so people, can suffer in the meantime while they're figuring out, I can't use or I can't ask my doctor for this, that, or the other to fix this. So that can spread out the time between infection and relief. Rotavirus is another big one, and I believe that's a global statistic. It kills 500,000 children per year. So this is like global health, world health, where people in developing countries, they have trouble maintaining clean, regular, safe access to affordable water in places where water is not considered a human right. And it gets in you, and children have relatively less robust immune systems than healthy adults do, and so this is one that we tend to see either in children or in an outdoor recreation context. We see a lot of people getting sick on cruise ships. Rotavirus nails a lot of people on cruise ships because everybody's in close, confined quarters, and if there's a single person working in the galley, the kitchen of that cruise ship, and they're not washing their hands, or they're pecking their butt, or whatever they do, that's a great way to get everybody on the ship sick. God bless rotavirus. All right, cyanobacteria we've already seen, and for macroscopic pathogens, we have stuff like this. All right, so those are mare's tail worms exploding out of the abdomen of a larval insect. And let's see if we got... I have a video from summer camp like 10 years ago at Canyonlands National Park where our only water source for that day is a puddle about 1 centimeter deep and the width of a dinner plate. And it had mare's tail worms and some kind of those like scorpion-looking larvae, and that was it. So we dropped our packs, we got our filters out, and we filtered out of water that literally looked like this looping lab captured video, right? So in some places where water supply is limited, you are, depending on your perspective or management practices and decisions, you are asking people to base their safety on ability to make water like this safe to drink. Or you are forcing them to do that. And Canyonlands National Park is one of those places where, in certain times of year, by about May 1st, it's real hot at Canyonlands. And the water sources are actively dwindling and going away, going underground one by one. So the backcountry rangers, a big part of their job is just walking the circuits, all the different trail loops at Canyonlands National Park, contacting visitors. Hey, I was just at this water source that you might be relying on, and it's just dried up as of today. So you either need to dig down in the sand to expose that water source and drain it a little bit more, or you need to hike on to the next water source, which is another 5.6 miles, and you need to take the first left in order to get there, right? So, the backcountry rangers, patrol rangers at Canyonlands, they're amazing. Like, their day job is to go hiking around Canyonlands. And one of the key responsibilities while they're hiking around is to check people's permits, their backpacking, their overnight camping tags, which are required by policy to be visible at all times on your pack or your person while you're hiking out there, and to ensure basic human safety and survival. Like, that's about as wholesome and straightforward as park rangering gets. That's a pretty pure distillation of it. Pretty cool stuff. So, what do we do about this? Right? We're starting to get into or get towards the management applications, solutions, the strategies and tactics that we use to cope with the physical, so like turbidity, the chemical, so like cyanobacteria, cyanotoxin contamination, the biological, all these different pathogens, and potentially the wildlife impacts of water resources. We're going to see on sort of official and municipal levels just like close the beach. When the water's full of cyanotoxins, we can't make that safe. We can't suck that pond or lake dry, filter that water, stick it back in. What we can do if we have to is suck the lake dry like we did here, pay some local farmer, I don't know how many thousands of dollars, to take all of the soil of all of the bottom of Campus Lake, bucket scoop the entire lake out, load all of that contaminated and deadly soil into dump trucks, and put it somewhere else so it's not our problem anymore. That's literally what Southern Illinois University had to do to make it safe for dogs and people around Campus Lake, right? So that kind of solves the problem temporarily. But what happens when, not if, those cyanobacteria come back, right? We're back to closures and boil warnings if we need to drink that water. Now, boiling E. coli contaminated water below certain altitudes and up to a certain temperature for a certain time kills off the E. coli. We've made the water safe to drink in that case. Boiling water reduces the amount of water because some of it is being liberated as steam, right? So if you start by boiling 1 liter, 1,000 milliliters of water, and you produce 1 liter of steam in boiling it, you now have 999 milliliters of water left. You lose some of the water to the atmosphere. So, for living contaminants, pathogens, you have to boil the water. Some bacteria, some thermophilic bacteria, specifically like living in boiling water. So boiling's not going to kill them. Some viruses are not particularly harmed by water that's boiled for 5 minutes, up to 180 degrees at elevation, whatever, and will survive that process. if the water has cyanobacteria neurotoxins in it, and we've lowered the amount of water, we have effectively increased the concentration, meaning the potency of that cyanotoxin in the water that we're about to cook and drink with. You see the problem? All right, so when you have recreationists at your national park, if you have a backcountry component to your national park, you need to assume that all of these different kinds of threats to human health are present. You need to understand that different ways of purifying water, making it safe to drink, making it potable, each address some, but not all, of the threats. So if we add chlorine to the water, anybody heard of adding a couple of drops of bleach per gallon of water to try and make it a little bit safer, and it tastes tap water, you can taste the chlorine in it, right? That'll kill a lot of stuff. It won't kill everything on our list. Right? Giardia, for example, is pretty resistant to chemical sterilization. Has anybody ever heard of a Miox pen, where you add salt into an electrolytic chamber, a little bit of water, zap it with a battery in there, and then dump the sodium and chlorine ions into the water you're trying to sterilize? Right? That's another way of doing that. Has anybody heard of a SteriPen, where you have a bright UV light that you dunk into your Nalgene, hit the button, and sort of stir the water with the bright UV light, and that's cooking off the bacteria, it's giving a bad sunburn to all the bacteria and so forth in there. Well, that kills stuff pretty well, except if that water has any floating chunks in it. Those floating chunks are shading. They're blocking that sterilizing UV light from all the stuff on the other side of that chunk. So none of these work perfectly. Has anybody ever used a backcountry water filter, like an MSR Waterworks or a pure Katahdin filter, anything like that? Okay. Those filters have pores. They have holes in them to allow water molecules through and hopefully nothing else. The problem is, when you have a nanometer-sized hole in a filter membrane, or film, or ceramic filter element, well, viruses aren't a whole lot, they are bigger, but they're not a whole lot bigger than a water molecule. Right? Viruses are structures of individual atoms. I mean, they are really, really, really small. And the problem is, if there's anything other than bacteria or viruses in that water, like sand, silt, clay particles, well, they are also hitting all those holes and getting lodged in those holes. So, a ceramic filter element can filter down to about virus size, but they can get clogged super, super easy. So you have to, for some of those, make the filter element removable. And you have to be able to physically scrape off all that stuff. As you're scraping off all the dust and dirt and silt that's stuck in the pores of your filter, you're also removing part of the filter itself. Right? These are fairly delicate ceramic structures, and so you can only clean it so many times before it no longer works. For a paper-based filter like the Pure filters, for example, the pore sizes are much larger, and so you're getting stuff like larger protozoans, you're getting larger bacteria, you're getting those amoeba. Amoeba are these huge unicellular organisms. Some are so big that you can even see them with the naked eye if you have excellent vision. You're filtering those out, but not the viruses and so forth. So everything is a trade-off in terms of making water safe. Typically, you're going to have to require or at least educate your visitors. Ultimately, the responsibility is on them. But you have to educate your visitors, like, you guys need a defense in-depth thing. So if you can boil and filter and chemically treat water from these 3 water sources, which we know are really bad because we test them for all this stuff, then you're going to be okay. And if you forget, or you decide not to boil and chemical and heat treat that water, well then you're probably going to get real sick, and it's going to be something off of our rogues gallery of things that make you real sick, right? So that strategy, in terms of helping people be safe against all of these, is modifying visitor behavior. We're not fixing the environment, we're not cleaning up those spring sources because we can't properly. But we can not force people to use the filter, we sure can educate them. Alright, so indirect visitor influencing, modifying behaviors through informing their choices. Alright. Finally, dealing with the inescapable pressure of people needing to poop, we can install toilets. We can install backcountry toilets called privies or outhouses or pit toilets or composting toilets. Lots of different flavors of those. Flavor is the wrong word when talking about feces. What a nutty joke. Anyway, we can enforce something like shallow burial, but we have to educate people with that requirement of, hey, if you're bringing things like wet ones, sterilizing antibacterial wipes to help get real clean back there, you can't bury those plastic fiber, non-woven fabric wipes on the ground because you're burying sheets of plastic and they're going to be there forever and ever and ever, right? But in the heat of the moment, some people may do that. Some people will do that. Some people will bring those plastic, fiber, non-woven fabric wet wipes and dump them down into your toilet. And that's going to clog up the septic pump truck that is going to suck, 5,000 gallons of feces and urine and that bright blue stuff that they put in the water in those reservoirs to try and kill the smell, but it never quite works. Yeah. Surface disposal is that smear procedure. That really isn't much of a thing anymore in most places. And finally, with things like wag bags or those chemical toilets, the pack it in, pack it out approach is totally valid everywhere, right? We can landfill these biohazard packs, and to the extent that we can have a healthy, responsible, grown-up conversation about that in the visitor center, and for years our recreation department here at the Major on campus for Adventure Leadership, they've been coming up with ways to have this conversation with junior high, high school kids out on an adventure recreation trip, turning it into a thing. Hey, this is the cool thing to do. Have you ever pooped in a bag before? Today's your day. Here we go. Right? So you can make it fun. You can make it interesting. You can make it an ethical appeal for folks who are a little bit higher on that moral development hierarchy of being post-conventional. Finally, biological impact can be nothing to do with human sickness, but everything to do with moving non-native invasive species which love to be disturbed, which love to cling onto our boots, onto the hulls of our ships, or our boats for recreation purposes, in the bilge water of boats and ships and so forth. So here in the southern Midwest, anybody know any aquatic, invasive, native or non-native, but invasive species that we pay attention to in places like Crab Orchard Lake or any of the other created lakes around southern Illinois, for example? Has anybody ever heard of duckweed? Okay. Duckweed is a very useful organism for things like pulling extra fertilizer, surplus fertilizer out of water and biosequestering it, right? But it can take over and increase the shading out of entire bodies of water by growing in a thick mat at the surface and changing the light availability, the sunlight availability down the rest of the entire water column for everything else that depends on native species in these waters. How about milfoil? Right? There's a lot of these, right? And that list of species is going to be different in every ecosystem, especially every ecoregion. So here in the southern Midwest, we pay a lot of attention to those and a few others. But, if one single a little bit of duckweed gets into one lake from another lake, that whole second lake now has a duckweed problem, right? So the dose, the minimum viable dose of aquatic plants is unfortunately very, very low. We don't need 10 million particles of it or organisms of it to effectively colonize a new body of water. This can be a thing. Also, transport of exotics for in recreation environments here in the Midwest. Has anybody heard of zebra mussels? All right, tell me about zebra mussels. What do you know about zebras? What do they do?
I just know we can't have hospitals anymore.
Say again?
We can't have hospitals anymore.
We can't have any fun because of zebra mussels. So zebra mussels came across the Pacific Ocean in bilge water, we think primarily from like container ships from Southeast Asia. And now we sort of buy everything from over there now, I guess. Anyway, decades ago, it got into American freshwater systems, and zebra mussels, each individual zebra mussel produces millions of offspring, and they are filter feeders. So they actually do the opposite of things like duckweed, which means that in filtering out water in like the Mississippi and particularly the Great Lakes and the sixth Great Lake, Lake Champlain, between New York and Vermont, what that does is it actually clears up the turbidity of the water. Everything that's floating in that water column that could be a potential food source or just biologically inert for the zebes, they pull that out of the water column and eat it. And so it absolutely takes over the entire lake bed of these inland seas, these very small oceans, these freshwater oceans that we call the Great Lakes, and utterly outcompetes everything in terms of like native mussels, clams, any other bivalves, and by filtering out all of the zooplankton, phytoplankton, our food source for everything else in the Great Lakes, they starve everything else out of existence because zebes have no natural predators here in the Western Hemisphere. And so they're already they're all over the place, and for years and years and years, when you saw signs saying, hey, you have to rinse off your boat before you get into this lake completely. You have to rinse off your boat the moment you trailer your boat out of this lake. It was because of zebra mussels, right? One or a couple getting from one lake to another, right? Producing millions of offspring per season. You know, it doesn't take but a couple of seasons for them to take over entire small bodies of water. I mean, just absolutely incredible how bad they are. All right, so that's the primary impact dynamics: physical, biological, chemical, exotics of water resources as a function of recreation, and that impact recreation and how the two impact each other. Let's move on to management thereof.